Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and begin in the interest of time since we have a lot of material, but we're so thankful that you are here today at Housing Washington at this session on planning for deeply affordable housing. First, a little bit about Commerce before I introduce myself. At the Department of Commerce, we strengthen communities through just about every avenue of economic development, planning, housing, and infrastructure. You normally know Commerce through the lens of our housing division, who is the main funder of a lot of affordable housing in Washington. But housing also threads through other avenues of Commerce, including the local government division, where the Growth Management Services helps local communities plan for the next 20 years of growth and housing in their communities, as well as some smaller programs in some of our other divisions, including community services and energy. My name is Laura Hodgson. I'm Housing Planning and Data Manager at the Department of Commerce, and in my role, I help communities plan for the next 20 years of housing growth through their comprehensive plans and development regulations, as well as help them plan for the siting of some of uses that haven't always been allowed in communities, which include shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing, and permanent supportive housing. I will probably be referring to those as STEP in this presentation, but I will present that acronym to you later on so that those of you who are new to the term are familiar with it. I am joined today by Adrienne Smith, who is a long-range planner at Port Townsend. Do you want to introduce yourself here real fast?
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. Can people hear me? Awesome. As Laura mentioned, I'm a long-range planner for the City of Port Townsend, which is on the Olympic Peninsula. So I'm going to get to present a bit about how our jurisdiction has implemented a lot of some of the laws that Laura is going to be explaining today, and also how we got to use a lot of Commerce's resources to do that.
Thank you. So before we begin, I wanted to just kind of understand who was in the room to get a little bit of feel for how we can tailor this presentation to you. So who in this room is an affordable housing developer? Awesome. Okay. And who is a nonprofit housing representative? Great. And who is, I had to kind of group them because there's lots of different people at the conference here today. A consultant, contract, or somebody who works in financing of affordable housing. Okay. And who's a state agency? Ooh, a lot of state agency folks. Awesome. And other. Who, oh, okay. Do you want to shout it out? Where are you from? No takers? Yakima? Yakima County. Yakima County. Anybody else? Seattle Housing. City of Littleton. City of Littleton. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip the next few questions because we have a lot of material, and I want to make sure that we allow a little bit of time for questions and answers. Also, a note that we would love you to put forth your questions in the WOVA app, if possible. That way we can read off the questions here and then answer them. And also, in case we don't have enough time to answer the questions, we can make sure to get you answers to those questions shortly after this session. And we also only have one mic, so make it a little easier. Today, I'd like to talk about the planning framework in Washington under the Growth Management Act. And apologies if I'm kind of looking to the side. I don't have the screen notes here. The housing planning requirements under the Growth Management Act. A focus on planning for low-income housing, how to do that in communities, laws you should know about low-income housing and how that regulatory framework from the state has changed recently, local steps to adopting those regulations that allow for and encourage more affordable housing, how you can get involved, and resources. So first, why is community planning important? First of all, I think we're all familiar with planning in our individual lives, whether that's planning a grocery list or planning for retirement or planning, what we're going to do for the weekend. Similarly, planning for our communities is an essential part of directing the long-term growth in our communities. It helps to protect the good things that we know about our communities and love. It helps to create a shared vision for our communities. It helps us be clear on what our community needs for, and then identify strategies for how to meet those needs and how to grow and meet that vision over time. And communities plan for their future through comprehensive plans. And a comprehensive plan is a plan that articulates the goals, the vision, the policies, the actions, and the implementation steps that local governments will take over the next 20 years and that guide elected officials, local government decisions, and local government financing decisions in their community. So it's an important piece of community work, and those comprehensive plans are being updated all across the state at this time. So under the Growth Management Act, communities are directed to update their comprehensive plans every 10 years. So communities in the orange are finishing their comprehensive plans by December of this year on a rolling basis through to the gray communities. Most communities in Washington are what we call fully planning under the Growth Management Act, which means that they do these plans, a full plan, and update their regulations to implement that plan. However, there are some communities in Washington that are partially planning under the Growth Management Act and only have to plan for certain areas. And these are our slower growing, smaller communities in Washington. And they still need to protect their natural resources and environmental areas, but don't have to do the more comprehensive planning that the other communities need to do. And the reason for doing this is because in 1990, the state realized that there was a lot of uncoordinated growth that was happening. You know, communities were spreading out. They weren't always having the infrastructure and services that they needed to support them. We were losing a lot of our agricultural rural farm areas, and we wanted to preserve some of those community features as well as make sure that growth was coordinated. So they directed local governments to develop comprehensive plans that plan for the land use, transportation, housing, natural resources, and environment. And do that through a comprehensive plan and then implement that through development regulations, the local laws that communities have. And in those comprehensive plans, communities are required to do 6 elements, or 5 or 6 elements, one of which is housing. And in that housing element, they look at the local housing needs, identify that there's sufficient land that is zoned for housing to meet those 20-year needs, identify what the barriers are to meeting those needs, and come up with an action plan to remove those barriers, and then also newly look at racially disparate impacts. And so in our group at Commerce, we work to support local governments as they do that work. And in that work, communities have the ability to plan for housing and also encourage deeply affordable housing. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about how within that overarching framework, communities are doing this work, what they are now required to do to better plan for lower income housing needs, and how you can get involved in that process to encourage them to do really great planning that will set the framework to allow affordable housing developers to come and build the housing that we need over the next 20 years. So a little bit about the requirements before we dive into how local communities are implementing these requirements. As I mentioned, or I haven't mentioned this yet, I'm going to mention it, in 2021, the state legislature directed the Department of Commerce to project the future housing needs for every community in Washington, because they also directed communities to, instead of encourage affordable housing, they directed them to plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments. So they needed to have a benchmark for how local communities knew how much housing to plan for. So they directed the Department of Commerce to project those housing needs for each community across all income segments. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. They also directed each local community to do a number of steps in their comprehensive plan to not only make sure that they have enough land for housing for all economic segments, but that they're identifying what those barriers are that were within the local government control and creating an action plan to remove those, as well as for the first time addressing racially disparate impacts in housing. We've all probably heard of redlining and exclusionary covenants, and this is the time for local governments to look at how their policies have led to or encouraged disparate impacts and exclusion in their communities and make plans to amend those and address those and remove those barriers to disparate impacts in their communities. So as I mentioned, we projected what the future housing needs were over the next 20 years. And over the next 20 years, we will need 1.1 million new housing units. In perspective, we have about 3.1 million housing units right now, so we have a ways to go. But what is even more interesting is that to address cost burdening in homeowner and renters in Washington state, we need to plan for a shift in the way that we have previously been planning for housing. Previously, under the Growth Management Act, people make sure that local governments were making sure that they had enough land to provide the number of houses that were needed. But most of those houses that were planned for were single-family homes that are now unattainable to most people based on the cost of housing. To make sure that that housing is actually meets the needs of each individual in Washington, more than half of the housing that is needed over the next 20 years needs to be for households less than 80% of area median income. So it means a big shift in the way that communities are gonna be planning for housing. And as you see here on the graphic, more affordable housing tends to be those housing units that are smaller, more units per lot, and also so that the costs are reduced and we can produce that in a more affordable way. So it'll mean that local communities will be needing to allow for a variety of housing types, including more dense housing types to accommodate these housing needs in the future. Also, the future housing needs, the projected housing needs identified that we need 91,000 units of emergency housing in 20 years, which is staggering considering that we have about 15,000 emergency housing beds right now. So communities will also be planning for that in their regulations. So once communities update their codes, once they plan for this housing, they will then need to update the regulations to make sure that they have the capacity in their zoning to accommodate these housing needs. And we support them with technical assistance in walking them through that process, grants, and model ordinances and other things like that. As I mentioned, we projected the future housing needs for every community in Washington, and what that showed was that, as I mentioned, we have 1.1 million new housing units that we need to plan for. But each community gets to determine how much growth it will plan for over the next 20 years. And we have a tool that will then project, based on how much growth they are envisioning over the future, what their housing needs are for each community that they plan for. And then at a county level, those housing needs will then be broken down and distributed to all of the jurisdictions. So 2024 jurisdictions, those jurisdictions who are finishing their comprehensive plan updates right now, have already gone through this work, but the counties throughout the state who are fully planning counties are deciding where growth goes right now and deciding where more affordable housing growth goes as they work to distribute these housing needs and plan for them in their local plans. So as communities do this, the Growth Management Act encourages local communities to think about how they can better plan for their lower income housing needs. There's the mantra that, if you plan for it, they will come. And it doesn't always work that way. You need other incentives to do that. So the framework that we recommend jurisdictions employ as they are working on the comprehensive plans and development regulations is first to develop those strong policies that set a vision for encouraging more affordable housing in their communities. As you saw in the previous slides, all communities are going to need to be planning for more housing that is affordable in their communities because we haven't been doing that historically. So this will set the stage for them to then make those policy level decisions about where additional housing capacity will go, where that higher density housing will go, and then also they will look to identify what those barriers are in addition to zoning that are preventing affordable housing from being built in their communities. But also it'll be great for them to also encourage and incentivize deeply affordable housing, because just allowing affordable housing and removing the barriers won't always get it done. And they have lots of tools for local governments to use to encourage deeply affordable housing, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So as I mentioned, communities will be identifying where they have the ability to build new housing over the next 20 years, and if they don't have sufficient capacity for the housing that is more affordable, they'll need to be making zoning changes. So communities will most likely be finding that they need to identify areas where they are going to allow a wider variety of housing types and higher densities of housing. And that will lead to some further discussions that they'll need to have in making sure that they have enough infrastructure over the next 20 years, because that's another component of the comprehensive plan, is to make sure that the infrastructure goes along with the housing. Then one of the new kind of newer pieces to the housing elements this year, this round, is identifying adequate provisions. So previously in the Growth Management Act, it wasn't defined what adequate provisions were, but now the legislature directed local communities to say, what are those barriers that are preventing housing from being built in your community? Is it development regulations, for example, maximum densities that are too low, high off-street parking requirements, unclear development regulations? Is permitting taking too long? Do you have conditional use processes or planned unit development processes that take an extensive amount of time that are preventing people from even building that type of housing that is allowed, usually that higher density, more affordable housing? And also, what are the barriers to deeply affordable housing, including emergency housing and permanent supportive housing? Communities will be taking a look at what those barriers are, identifying them in their plans, and then coming up with actions to remove those barriers over the next 20 years. But in addition to that, they also have the ability to incentivize affordable housing. And this hopefully will help those affordable housing developers here in this room and those who fund affordable housing development to make things pencil more. So they're going to be looking over these next few years, or what are the things that are under our control that we can adjust so that we can, in exchange for affordable housing development, give them something in return. And under the state statute, they can offer additional density, they can offer fee waivers and exemptions, they can offer waivers of different requirements, they can expedite permitting, they can also even offer free and reduced price land. All of these are ways that local governments can bring something to the table to encourage more affordable housing. And I have a list of cities who have some innovative ways that they've done that on the side of the screen. But in addition to those kind of normal ways that us planners look at incentivizing deeply affordable housing, there are also unique ways that local communities can work to encourage deeply affordable housing. And we would love for those people in this room who know a lot about deeply affordable housing or affordable housing in general to be engaged in the process with these local planners who are identifying what are the ways that they can partner with developers to encourage more affordable housing in their communities. Some of those ways that they can do that, but they're open to your suggestions, is encouraging, allowing more density on land owned by religious organizations. That's a requirement. They can partner with nonprofit partners and religious organizations. They can do infrastructure improvements so that they are creating, the infrastructure that will allow that affordable housing project to work out and not have to implement that infrastructure themselves, and the other ideas on this slide here. So transitioning into the laws, after communities do all of that planning work, they also have to update their regulations to make sure that they are consistent with the latest laws that the legislature has passed. And the legislature has had a big focus on housing the past few years, and as such, local communities have a lot of work that they need to do. I'm going to focus on those new laws that focus on deeply affordable housing, so those housing for households below 50% of area median income. There are also lots of other new laws that were passed recently, including the accessory dwelling unit law, 1337, and middle housing, 1110, that communities will also across the state be needing to implement. But in 2021, the legislature passed House Bill 1220 that articulated where cities need to allow step housing, so emergency shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing, and permanent supportive housing. And they also said that if you're a fully planning jurisdiction, you also need to plan for enough land capacity for these housing types. They did say, though, that recognizing that each local community has specific needs and specific desires and specific local contexts, that it is okay to have reasonable occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use requirements. So that means that you could have a spacing distance between projects, or you could limit the size of a project, but you still need to have enough ability to build all those future housing needs that they identified from their process earlier before. In addition to that, there's a few other laws that are really important that we would love for you as advocates and affordable housing developers to be aware of, because local governments are not always as up to speed on these requirements, and they're important for us to, as a state, fulfill and meet our local housing needs. And those are that local governments may not adopt, oppose, or enforce requirements on affordable housing that are different than housing development generally. And affordable housing would be any subsidized housing that has a lease. So that would include permanent supportive housing. And also look to encourage other types of affordable housing in ways that other types such as assisted living facilities and adult family homes. A few other laws to know about before I wrap up here and with how you can be involved, and turn this over to Adrian. Local jurisdictions also need to allow co-living, conversion of commercial buildings to multifamily, and not limit the number of unrelated people that live together. So I'm going to breeze through this. Apologies. Please take a picture if you need to, because I do want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for questions.
And the slideshow will be available after the event.
Yes.
The slideshow will also be available after the event,
So how do communities go about doing this process, and how can you get involved in the process? So when communities plan, they have a number of steps that they take as they regulate land within their jurisdiction. First, they develop a greater vision for their community. They develop the comprehensive plan, which is on a 10-year cycle. They update the laws and rules that guide when projects are allowed, what processes those projects need to follow, how much they need to pay, if they need to pay anything for a permit or for infrastructure. Those are the development regulations. And then they permit individual projects that come in. So there's a long step that goes into envisioning what is actually allowed on each individual property. Under the Growth Management Act, the goal of the act is to allow a lot of engagement in the earlier steps in the visioning of a community. That's where there's a requirement that every community do public engagement to make sure that communities have a say in how they grow and where that growth goes and what that growth looks like. And then communities also get a say in how those individual rules govern what projects are allowed in specific places and what those processes are. The intent under the state framework of planning is not to allow as much involvement at the permitting stage, because the intent is that local community input has been developed at the comprehensive plan and the development regulation stage. The intent of this is so that when a property owner comes through and develops their property, they know exactly what they can build because it's already been defined in the code. So with that framework in mind, local communities will be looking for your input in the comprehensive plan and the development regulations stage as they set that framework for local projects. More specifically, as they update their comprehensive plans, they'll be specifically looking for you to get involved with identifying what are those places that are more appropriate for growth in their communities. As I mentioned, we have a lot of needs at the lower income housing levels that will need to be accommodated with higher density housing. Where is that appropriate? Is that appropriate in areas with transit and services and infrastructure? Is there a more distributed approach be taken? And then also, once that is identified, what are those additional barriers that are really the hiccups to preventing affordable housing projects from penciling? Is it, the parking ratios are too high and I can't afford to build that much parking for my project, or the infrastructure costs are too high, and therefore maybe a proportional impact fee program where affordable housing has to pay less per unit than regular housing might be something to look at. All of those things are things that local governments will be looking for your input on to guide not only their work now as they update the regulations, but over the next few years. So as I mentioned, this is the cycle for communities doing this work. Even those communities who are in the 2024 process still have opportunities, so those in orange still have opportunities to provide input. Communities are refining their plans and their regulations right now. Everybody else across the state, you're at various stages of the planning process. So we encourage you to sign up for information about your local planning process and engage with them. And you can do that by providing technical assistance, doing code review, providing real-world examples. Local planners don't always understand the what is involved with a project penciling out, and they really need your input to make sure they identify what those barriers are. Local governments are also interested in having people come and attend their public community meetings and say, yes, I want more housing in this area. Yes, I want more affordable housing. Yes, it's okay if we have this trade-off and more affordable housing gets these benefits in exchange for more affordable housing so that my teachers, my firefighters, the people who work at my grocery store can afford to live in my community. So you can get involved by following your local community's comprehensive plan process, following when your community is changing the regulations, commenting on that plan, and just reaching out to your planners. If you want to have a meet and greet with them or sit down and review a code, they are always happy to do that with you in most cases. And with that, I'd just like to close with a few resources before I turn it over to Adrian. First, I want to let all of you in this room know that the legislature has funded dispute resolution for developers who are looking to site supportive housing and emergency housing in their communities. If you're having trouble citing a project or a local community's regulations don't align with those state requirements that I mentioned on those previous slides, please reach out to this email address. There'll be a gov delivery or a kind of like a press release going out on this on Monday, and it will be on our website on Monday, but please reach out to me for more questions. We want to be able to resolve any of those issues and disagreements and encourage those housing projects from being built. And we have a lot of resources on our website. So we have a lot of resources walking you through what local governments are going to be doing as they do this planning work, as well as resources specifically for STEP housing. So we have a model ordinance to walk communities through how to make good decisions for where emergency housing, shelters, and permanent supportive housing should be located and how to regulate those. We have some communications materials, and we have implementation case studies. And with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Adrian. And please feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat. It will hopefully have a few minutes at the end, and if not, we will make sure to get to those in the app.
Awesome.
And forward is there.
Awesome, thank you. All right, have we got the next slideshow up? There we go. All right. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Adrian Smith. I'm a long-range planner at the City of Port Townsend, and what I'm going to be talking about today is how our city was able to start implementing some of the laws that Laura shared with you, and specifically how we were able to do that by working with our local housing and service providers. So as an outline, we're going to start by talking about the local context in Port Townsend. Then I'll move on to talking more specifically about how we developed our 2024 code update, which was all about STEP, that acronym that Laura mentioned, and then finally moving on with a few key points on how you could get involved in STEP code in your jurisdiction. So just to start, Port Townsend is on the very northern tip of the Olympic Peninsula, right up there where there's a red star. We're a city of just over 10,000 people, so pretty small. We get to know each other pretty well. We're also a fully planning city under the Growth Management Act, which means that we plan for our city using a comprehensive plan that sets 20 years goals, as well as through development regulations that set things like how many parking spaces do you need, how close can a building be to the right-of-way, how many parking spaces do you need, all that kind of stuff. Those regulations that I mentioned can be updated on an annual cycle. Here's the timeline for how that works in Port Townsend from December, when our city council opens the annual amendment process, which is a great time for folks to start getting involved in STEP and talking about, yes, we want to propose amendments this year, we want to speak in support of amendments for STEP. And then if you engage early in the process by attending council meetings, planning commission meetings, working with your planning office, that's a great way to give really broad feedback on the goals for the year. As you move throughout the year, your feedback can get more specific. For example, the process in Port Townsend is that the Planning Commission holds a public hearing on the final docket of proposed amendments and then recommend which of the amendments City Council should approve. That's a great time for you to speak on the individual lines of code. What do you think is working well, and what do you wish City Council would, the Planning Commission and City Council would change about it before it's passed? Those decisions are then considered in a workshop, and finally approved by City Council in the spring. You can also provide more substantive feedback during those periodic reviews that happen every 10 years, like Laura mentioned. This is a quick overview of the engagement timeline for Port Townsend on our plan. Again, you get to start by giving feedback on very broad goals. What do you want for your community over the next 20 years? And then provide more and more detailed feedback on, okay, if everything in your jurisdiction has heard so far, what are the conflicts in our goals? How do we prioritize? How do we balance? So now that you know a bit more about the regulatory framework in Port Townsend, I'd like to share about some of the housing pressures we're seeing. You probably have a lot of these in your communities too. First is that Port Townsend has a very high cost of living. That's especially difficult because we have a wide range of incomes in the city. Some of the high cost of living is because of our geographic isolation. Living on the end of a peninsula is beautiful. We're surrounded on waters by three sides. It's gorgeous. It's very expensive to get stuff there. That especially applies to the cost of building housing there. It takes more money to get the materials there. It also takes more money to get workers there. We have a great group of contractors and builders in Port Townsend, but most of them are more experienced with single-family housing, which, while excellent, doesn't provide a lot of the levels of affordability that we see that we need in Port Townsend and throughout the state. All of these pressures were dramatically increased by the COVID-19 pandemic, while at the same time, the pandemic really reduced the capacity of our existing shelters. We have one congregate shelter in town that had to significantly scale back on how many people could sleep there due to social distancing and air circulation concerns. So back in early 2020, our local housing and service providers responded to that by thinking about how can they create shelters that don't force people to be in the same room. And what they came up with was what we're calling wooden tents. A nonprofit called Community Build started building these one-room structures that are a really effective shelter. However, they don't meet the legal definition of a dwelling unit. So here's a couple of photos from their website of the construction process. Gives you a sense of the size of these. They're basically bedroom units, and then there are kitchen and bathroom facilities that are shared elsewhere. So since these weren't allowed under our existing codes, our nonprofits and our service providers got together with the city and county governments to get creative about what sort of permitting process can we create in a hurry, because there's a pandemic and people need to get inside and be sheltered. So collaborated to create that permitting process. The really central issue there was making sure we had safety requirements that would follow the regulations we have for our building code, as well as make sure that East Jefferson Fire and Rescue would be able to respond to emergencies in these shelters. The solution that we came up with at that time was what's called a temporary conditional use permit. Essentially what that means is that these wooden shelters were permitted for 6 months at a time. This gave the city time to figure out, are these shelters working? Are they holding up well to the elements? Are there any conflicts between this new village of wooden tents and the surrounding uses? Good news, they work really well. Bad news, you need to update the permit every 6 months. That's essentially time and money and basically just energy that managing agencies could spend better by working with their clients instead of having to come back to our office over and over. Because this code was also written so quickly, there were some inconsistencies with our existing code and some lack of clarity, which means that, again, our office got to have a lot of meetings with our friends who were building these and be like, okay, what did we mean when we wrote this? That created similar problems for the city as well. When this code was first written, we had really limited staff and really limited time. And once we got out of that state of emergency, we found that re-reviewing those permits every 6 months wasn't the best use of our resources either. Essentially, the conditional use process, it addressed the emergency, it was very useful, and it doesn't fully meet all of our goals. And then, of course, there were the legal updates that Laura mentioned in 2021. So once we had our annual amendments open up again, we got to work on figuring out how can we solve these problems. So we worked a lot from community feedback for that, and it was really possible for the city because by that point we had more staff and could demonstrate that these shelters are working and our current code is insufficient, and this cycle is the right time to address the problem. So here is, I'm going to try to go through this faster than planned in respect of time about how we worked with our local housing providers to write a better code. We started by reviewing what we already have and comparing that with regulations in similar cities. From there, we then compared it with those new regulations that Laura mentioned, most of which came from House Bill 1220. To make sure that we were being consistent across jurisdiction lines, we had joint meetings of the Jefferson County and Port Townsend Planning Commissions so that we're all working from the same definitions for shelters and emergency housing because we didn't want our service providers to have to go through a completely different process depending on which side of the city line they're on. From there, what my coworkers and I got to do was really exciting, was actually reach out to the local service providers as well as some local advocates to say, we want to do this better. What's working now? What would you want to see improve? Very graciously, several of those service providers we reached out to scheduled time to hold meetings with staff. We got to talk about their missions and how those do align with the city's goals for housing and how we can work together on those. Specifically, we talked about what would make it easier for them to operate in the city and what can we do to support them in the permitting process. Those conversations were really fruitful. A lot of what we heard about was just that the timelines on the conditional use process weren't working, and there were more types of shelters that they would like to construct that weren't currently allowed by our code. So, based on that conversation, as well as conversations with our planning commission, staff then got to write what we called minimum specifications. There's a list of, here's all our legal requirements, here's everything we've heard from our service providers. What's the bare minimum of regulations that we need to make sure that we're meeting all of our goals? We're not imposing any additional requirements that we wouldn't require for a hotel or an apartment or another residential use. We shared those draft minimum specifications with all parties for their feedback and edits, got some great edits. And then from there, we got to start drafting the code itself based on the minimum specifications. That means that from the beginning, when I was writing that code, I knew that we were following the law and serving our partners. From there, we went through a couple rounds of revision and editing with the service providers, planning commission, and those housing advocates. Once we had something that those groups were satisfied with, I got to take it back to a few other groups. First, within my office, I got to talk a lot more with our permitting staff and other planners about, as this is written, is it something that you can clearly read and interpret? Can we make permit forms for this? So they had some great edits to make things consistent and just clarify issues like what kind of inspections will different types of shelters need. We also ensured cross-jurisdiction consistency by sharing that draft with our partners in the county. And finally, we got approval from East Jefferson Fire and Rescue and the Port Townsend Police Department, who confirmed that they could provide emergency services in any shelters that follow these regulations. After that, it was back to our partners, partnering service providers and the Planning Commission to confirm that here's some changes we made, here's why, here's how they're still supporting our goals. And then those service providers actually attended Planning Commission meetings to describe what the process was like for them of working with us and confirm that the code we were proposing is what they wanted and does serve their goals as well. Finally, we went to a public hearing with City Council where service providers, again, attended the meeting, spoke in support of the process and the code, suggested a few last amendments, specifically about providing safe parking. City Council approved the regulations with their suggested amendments. And this is now a map of all of the zones in Port Townsend where tiny shelter villages are allowed. So if it's green, they're allowed there. If it's orange, that's property that's owned by the port that could theoretically be used for it, but probably won't because it's full of boats. And red is where they're not allowed because that is either a park or a public facility like our sewer treatment plant where you really don't want housing anyway. So my main takeaways from this, first, As an employee of the city, it was fantastic to get to work with our housing providers. We can get a lot more done when we work together. It was great. Would love to work with these people again, and I get to because I'm working on the comp plan with them. Second is that it was so effective because we were able to state and recognize our shared goals, so we could always return to those when we were on one of our many, many code revisions. Another great point was that it's worth working with your neighboring jurisdictions so that your services are consistent no matter what side of the city line you're on. One thing that I think was really important to notice is that if an applicant wants to apply for a type of shelter that isn't currently allowed and you hear, our code doesn't currently allow that, that doesn't always have to be a no. It could be, how can we work together to write new code that allows these structures? And then finally, the most important outcome, or the most important note that I want to make about this is that regulations for emergency shelters and emergency housing alone cannot solve the lack of deeply affordable housing in any city or in the state. These regulations need to be paired with other work to support affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, all of those other levels of STEP. So, okay. How you can get involved in your community. First of all, definitely check where your jurisdiction is in their periodic review, and if you have one that's ongoing, check out their website to find out about when they are in their process and how you can get engaged, whether you're at the very beginning and can give feedback on broad goals, or if you're towards the end and can give feedback about specific proposals of the updated code. At any point in the process, it's always a great idea to attend your planning commission meetings, and you can provide spoken or written feedback. It's always worth using Commerce's resources on how jurisdictions can make those adequate provisions for STEP housing. If you see something in Commerce's resources that you think would work well for your jurisdiction, do reach out to your local planning office. And then please, please, please attend our outreach events and our public meetings about our comprehensive plans. We're setting goals for the next 20 years. We want you to set them too. If you're noticing that the outreach events aren't reaching as many people as you think they could, you can offer to co-host an event with your jurisdiction. Housing Solutions Network in Jefferson County co-hosted a focus group with us. That was great. All right. If your jurisdiction is out of its periodic review process, you can definitely still be involved in your annual amendments by finding out what amendments are on the docket. If they're related to STEP, attend those meetings, speak in support of them, suggest improvements for them. All right, that covers what I've got. Do we have time for questions?
We do have time for a few questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to read from the app. But please enter your questions in the app, and we will make sure to do our best to, if not answer them now, answer them right after. So one of the questions was, what are some strategies to connect and support the planning department in the development of strategies for deeply affordable housing? And I think Adrian touched on that, but first become educated on what your community needs are, where the barriers are, and what types of strategies you think might be effective for the types of housing that you need. We have a lot of resources at Commerce, including our adequate provisions checklist on our Planning for Housing webpage. We also have a Housing Action Plan Guidance Report, which walks through about 60 different affordable housing strategies, and you can look and see which ones are more appropriate for your local jurisdiction. And then reach out to your local planning staff. Attend those planning commission meetings, but if you also don't feel comfortable talking in front of a planning commission, reach out and see if you can have a one-on-one. As Adrian mentioned, she met one-on-one with some of the housing providers, and you got not only a great opportunity to get your feedback heard by staff who will then carry your recommendations forward, but you also can ask questions and get more input. Would you add anything to that, Adrian?
No, really well said. Again, please come to your planning commission meetings. It gets lonely there when it's just us and the commissioners.
And when you do go, just recognize that under a planning commission meeting, normally they have an agenda, so they will follow that agenda. But at the end of that agenda or at specific points in the process, they will have specific times for the public to provide input. Mm-hmm. If there's a lot of people there, they will limit you to the amount of time, so just be aware that you might be limited to 3 minutes. But what you say there gets heavily weighted. I'm on not even a planning commission, I'm a local board a local advisory committee, and we basically listen to what the community says and recommend it to the next body up. So it's really important to have your voice heard there at planning commission meetings.
Oh, I would also just mention most planning commission meetings have hybrid options. So as Laura mentioned, if you're not comfortable speaking at a meeting, you can send in written comment, but you can also attend through Zoom or GoToMeeting, depending on what software your jurisdiction has. So you don't even have to go to City Hall at night. You can do this from the comfort of your home.
I'm going to answer a quick question. You mentioned before the funding for dispute resolution. Are those services contracted through the dispute resolution centers or with Commerce? We have issued an RFP to find dispute resolution firms specifically for this supportive housing and emergency housing work, as well as a few other types of areas that we do work on in growth management. And so it's a few of the contractors that we hired through that competitive process. But I have talked with both of them, and they are both great. So please reach out. We would love for you to take advantage of that opportunity. Another question that was thumbed up is, what are the tools to enforce the adoption of HB 1220 in comp plans? For example, if a community does not make efforts to accommodate affordable housing. So there's a few different avenues for this. First, I wanted to let you know that we at Commerce have recently hired staff to help work with communities up front. It's really important to do the work up front and to communicate as much as possible while the plans are being worked on, so that we don't have to go through the retroactive approach, because it's not as easy. So we have staff that are reviewing every comp plan, comparing it to the state requirements, reviewing every development regulation that comes in, and providing comments to local governments with the hope that they will amend their codes and address affordable housing. We also encourage you to attend those meetings and explain your individual stories. Sometimes planning commission members, city council members don't always understand the stories of their communities, and so you can speak up and explain those stories, and those carry a lot of weight. If it gets to the point where a community has adopted a plan, there are a few, there's one action that you can take, and that is you can appeal to the Growth Management Hearings Board within 60 days of the adoption of a comprehensive plan or development regulation. But you must have commented on the process. You must have been engaged and submitted comments to the city in some way, shape, or form to appeal that to the Growth Management Hearings Board. We can do that at Commerce as well. We just don't normally do that because we have to get the governor's approval, so it's very rare. But that is the checks and balances. So we encourage you to be involved early, because that process is a little bit more involved. If it is a permitting decision, and a permit is denied, there is the Land Use Petition Act, where again, you can appeal, but in that case, you only have 21 days. That's why we wanted to let you know about this dispute resolution program, where if it is a STEP project, which is emergency shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing, or permanent supportive housing, you, in addition to those two avenues of Growth Management Hearings Board and Land Use Petition Act, you also have the dispute resolution process to address and work out any issues. So please reach out to us for that. And with that, we are at time, so thank you so much. Thank you for coming today. We will do our best to answer the questions. There's one in here I need to talk to you about, so I'm going to reply in there. If you ask that question, try to come find me during the conference. And thank you so much. Have a great Housing Washington.
Thank you all.